I was working under Earl Tanner's old truck when the sky changed color. It was not the color of a storm. It was not the sickly yellow we get before a tornado comes through the valley. This was a strange green, like someone had poured oil across the sun, and it came with a low sound that seemed to shake the ground itself. I slid out from under the truck just in time to see 3 huge ships drop out of the clouds above Boone Hollow. They were the size of grain silos, and they hung in the air without a sound, as if they were waiting for something. Earl looked up from his coffee cup. "That's new," he said, in the same calm voice he uses when talking about the weather. "Sure is," I said. Nobody in town screamed, nobody ran. I know that sounds strange, because every movie about aliens landing shows people running through the streets in a panic. But Boone Hollow is not that kind of town. We have about 400 people, 1 stoplight, and a church older than the state itself. Around here, folks do not scare easily. The last time anyone saw real panic was when a bull got loose from the Henderson farm, and even then, half the town came out just to watch. The ships landed in Wendell Miller's cornfield, crushing almost 2 acres of corn that was not ready to be picked yet. That seemed to upset Wendell more than the actual alien landing. He kept saying his insurance company was not going to believe this. Then the doors of the ships opened, and tall, thin, gray figures stepped out. They moved in a strange, jointed way, like puppets pulled by too many strings. They carried devices that hummed softly, and they seemed to speak without moving their mouths, sending their words straight into our heads. They walked toward town as if they already owned it. That was their first mistake. Most invasion stories happen in big cities, with tall glass buildings and crowds of people running in every direction. Nobody ever imagines what happens when strange visitors land in a small farm town, where almost every house has a gun rack by the door, and where many grandparents still remember serving in wars far from home. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was the first person out on the street. He carried his father's old hunting shotgun, the same one he used every autumn for bird season. "Everybody stay calm and get inside," he called out, using the same tone he uses when kids ride their bikes without helmets. But most people did not go inside. Instead, they stepped out onto their porches to see what was happening. I will not pretend this was easy, or that it made perfect sense for us to face something that had traveled across the stars to reach our little town. But there is something important that people from big cities often forget. Farming towns are full of folks who have handled guns since they were children. It is not because we like violence. It is because when a wild animal threatens the chickens at night, you cannot stop and think it over. You have to act. Old Miss Maribel Coates, who played the organ every Sunday at church, stepped onto her porch holding her late husband's hunting rifle. She looked at the strange creatures walking near her garden and said, quite calmly, "I don't care much for how you're looking at my tomatoes." Then she went back inside to get more supplies, as if this were just another ordinary chore. The 2 Henderson brothers rode up on their 4-wheelers, each one holding a shotgun, treating the whole event like an early start to hunting season. Wendell Miller, still furious about his ruined corn, drove his combine harvester straight toward one of the smaller landing pods, yelling about property damage the entire time. It was not clean or simple, and it did not look like something from a movie. We were scared. Some of our neighbors were hurt, and that is something none of us will forget. But those visitors were not ready for a town where people did not panic. They were not ready for people who, instead of running, said, "Let's go get the truck and the good flashlight," and move toward the trouble instead of away from it. By the time soldiers from the National Guard finally arrived, almost 6 hours later, dressed in clean uniforms and ready to take charge, Boone Hollow had already handled the situation on its own. 2 of the ships were gone, pushed back into the sky, and the 3rd one flew away with visible damage, thanks to Wendell's combine. The commanding officer asked Sheriff Pruitt what exactly had happened. Dale just reloaded his shotgun and said, "Some visitors landed in the wrong cornfield." Later, government officials came through town, writing reports and asking many questions about how ordinary people had managed to hold their ground. I told them the truth. There was no special plan. There were just 400 people who had been raised to look out for their homes and their neighbors, and who did not much care what the danger looked like, as long as they were protecting the people they loved. That night, after the last ship disappeared over the hills, the town gathered near the old feed store, the way we always do after something big happens, whether it is a storm, a flood, Or now, apparently, a visit from beings from another world. Someone brought out folding chairs. Someone else brought sweet tea. It felt strange to sit together so calmly after everything that had happened, but that is simply how Boone Hollow works. When something shakes us, we come together, share food, and talk it through until it feels smaller. Wendell was still going on about his corn. "You'd think the government would have some kind of program for alien crop damage," he said, shaking his head. "I've got insurance for hail, insurance for fire, but nothing for spaceships." "Maybe you should write a letter," Earl said, smiling behind his coffee cup. "Maybe I will," Wendell said, though everyone knew he probably would not. Miss Maribel sat quietly in her chair, her rifle now resting against the wall of the feed store, looking as ordinary as a walking cane. Someone asked her if she had been frightened. "A little," she admitted, "but I've raised 4 children and buried a husband. Fear doesn't stop me from doing what needs doing. It just walks along beside me." Her words stayed with me long after that night. Over the following days, scientists and government workers came through Boone Hollow, taking notes, studying the burned patches of grass where the ships had landed, and asking about every small detail. They wanted to know how a town without any special training had managed to hold off something so advanced. I think the answer was simple, even if it did not fit neatly into their reports. We were not fighting because we were brave in some grand movie-like way. We were fighting because Boone Hollow was our home, and home is not something you give up without trying. When something threatens the place where your family sleeps, where your children play, and where your friends have lived their whole lives, you do not stop to calculate the odds. You simply act, the same way you would fight off a fire spreading toward your barn, or block a flood from reaching your basement. The days after the attack were strange in their own way. The National Guard set up a small camp at the edge of town, and reporters began showing up with cameras and microphones, eager to hear from the people of Boone Hollow. Sheriff Pruitt tried his best to answer their questions politely, though I could tell he was growing tired of repeating the same story again and again. One reporter asked him if he was worried the aliens might return. "They're welcome to try," Dale said, without a hint of fear in his voice. "But I reckon they'll remember what happened last time." Another reporter asked me what it felt like to see something like that appear out of nowhere. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "It felt like watching a storm roll in," I said. "You don't get to choose when trouble arrives. You just decide how you're going to face it when it does." As the weeks passed, life in Boone Hollow slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The scorched fields where the ships had landed were replanted, though Wendell made sure to remind everyone, quite often, about the corn he had lost. Miss Maribel returned to playing the organ every Sunday, as calm and steady as ever. The Henderson brothers went back to riding their four-wheelers around the farm, though now they liked to joke that they had officially become experts in alien encounters. But something had changed in the town, even if it was hard to describe. People stood a little taller. Neighbors checked in on each other a little more often. Strangers who once might have simply nodded at each other on the street now stopped to talk, remembering how they had stood shoulder to shoulder during those frightening hours. I remember sitting on my porch one evening, weeks after everything had settled down, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky had returned to its normal blue and orange colors, with no strange green light in sight. Earl walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and handed me one before sitting down beside me. "You ever think they'll come back?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But if they do, I reckon we'll be ready." Earl nodded slowly, looking out over the fields. "Funny thing," he said, "all my life, I figured if aliens ever showed up, it'd be soldiers and scientists who saved the day. Never thought it'd be Wendell's combine and Miss Maribel's rifle." I laughed at that, because it was true. There was nothing grand or perfectly planned about what had happened. It was just ordinary people doing what they always do when trouble arrives, standing their ground, protecting their homes, and looking out for one another. Sometimes, when I think back on that day, I remember the strange green sky, the humming sound of the alien ships, and the fear that gripped all of us in those first few moments. But mostly, I remember the sound of Miss Maribel's calm voice as she spoke about her tomatoes, the sight of Wendell driving his combine with pure determination, and the quiet strength of neighbors coming together without needing to be told what to do. I do not know if the visitors who came to Boone Hollow ever understood what kind of town they had landed in. Perhaps they expected an easy, quiet farming community, unprepared and afraid. Instead, they found people who had faced storms, floods, and hard winters their whole lives, people who were used to relying on each other when things got difficult. In the end, the story of that day became something the whole town told over and over, at dinners, at church gatherings, and at the feed store where folks liked to sit and talk in the evenings. Each time it was told, it seemed to grow a little, with new details added here and there, but the heart of the story always stayed the same. It was the story of an ordinary town that did not run from something extraordinary, but instead stood together and faced it, side by side. Wendell's corn eventually grew back, though he still complains sometimes about the 2 acres he lost that day. Miss Maribel's tomatoes turned out better than ever that summer, something she says proves that a little excitement is good for the soil. And Sheriff Pruitt still carries his father's old shotgun with him, though thankfully, he has not had to use it on anything more dangerous than a stray coyote since that day. As for me, I still work on trucks and tractors most days, just like before, but every now and then, when I look up at the sky and see it turn a strange shade of color before a storm, I think back to that day, and I remember how quickly ordinary people can become extraordinary when their home is threatened. Boone Hollow may be small, and it may not have fancy technology or trained soldiers waiting on every corner, but it has something just as powerful. It has people who care deeply about their homes, their neighbors, and their land. And when that kind of care is threatened, no matter what shape the threat takes, whether it comes from the sky, the earth, or somewhere far beyond the stars, the people of Boone Hollow will always stand their ground. That, more than anything else, is the real story of what happened here. Not the ships, not the strange creatures, and not even the shotguns and rifles that came out that day. It is the story of a small town that proved, without needing to prove anything at all, that courage does not always come from soldiers or scientists. Sometimes, it comes from a farmer angry about his corn, an old woman worried about her tomatoes, and a sheriff who simply wanted his neighbors to be safe. And if those visitors ever decide to return, I have a feeling Boone Hollow will be ready once again, standing calm and steady, just as it always has.